Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our first session on the workshop on good regulatory practices and its implementation in the medical device sector. We're going to be allowing for 1 minute for the attendees that have already registered to connect, and then we will get started. Thank you and welcome. Okay, so well, let's get started. This is really a great pleasure for the MDRC project and in collaboration with SAPRA to deliver this very first webinar workshop on good regulatory practices and its implementation in the medical device sector. We are really very happy to have you all here, and we would like to start with some housekeeping items for all of us to have the best possible output out of our participation in the session today. So this session is being recorded, and the recording and the materials are going to be uploaded afterwards later in the week up to the MDRC website. All the attendees' microphones are closed as to prevent any background noise and to make it possible to have a fluid event. As for the Q&A, as we really want this to be a very interactive session, we kindly propose you to post them using the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform that is located at the bottom, at the menu in the bottom of your screen. And a kind reminder to our speakers, if you can have your cameras on while your presentation, so we can also take the most advantage of this. So we are gonna be covering today, and probably this is a little, sorry for this in terms of the size of the font, but we have really a very nice and very comprehensive agenda as to introduce an overview on what good regulatory practices are about. We are really very pleased to have Renata Amaral, who is the lead on good regulatory practices and trade for the Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project. We will have also joining us Dr. Tbt, that is like our co-host for these events, moderating the session where we're going to be talking about international benchmarks for medical devices framework. And also we will have from the World Health Organization, Ms. Agnes Quillo. And we also have from the technical office of SAPRA, Canisile Nkuku. Then we will have the participation of representatives from the World Trade Organization and the South African Bureau of Standards in a session where we're going to be discussing on international benchmarks also and good regulatory practices and technical barriers to trade in a session that is going to be moderated by Renata Amaral. So without further ado, we are really very pleased to welcome all of you in here. As you are probably aware, the MDRC project is, as we name it, is the Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project on COVID-19. The identification of potential bottlenecks to continue to respond to the pandemic, but also and probably at this stage of the pandemic, more importantly, to support the regulators in several countries that are part of this project, as to be better prepared to tackle any future potential pandemic. And we are really very proud and very appreciative of the work that Dr. Tbt, her team, and SAPRA is doing in this regard. So really, thank you very much. This is a collaborative effort that intends to support all relevant stakeholders in the medical technology sector. So Dr. Tbt, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the collaboration of all your team. And I would invite you to share some welcome words with our attendees. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sandra, and good afternoon to colleagues. And I really appreciate that kind of an introduction and the intention of our collaboration as, as two entities to ensure, the intention is to ensure compliance to the regulatory requirements that will be put forward by SAPRA. So really, thanks everybody who is now part of this proceedings, including the speakers who agreed to come and speak to the topics at hand. And I just want to give a brief, and also the industry for joining. There have been a lot of questions on Reliance method that we'll be using, and also the global benchmarking that will be presented from our review by our colleague, Ms. Agnes Kijo. We're thankful for the support, but with this intention of this collaboration is to ensure we communicate that SAPRA is embarking on a process of Reliance, and will be, communicating the processes and the procedures of Reliance to the industry so that they understand it from, we all learn together at the same time. So thank you very much as well from a support from our MDRC colleagues, as well as support from our colleagues from WHO, from also AMDF are supporting us in these proceedings to ensure that we communicate with our colleagues in the industry on what will be the proposed requirements. So we thought through that this will be helpful to go through this process, discuss what is the global, requirements, good regulatory practice, good regulatory reliance method, as well good reliance method prior to us implementing. And I think everyone in South Africa is anticipating the day that we will be publishing the product registration, but at least we would have highlighted the processes that we are also embarking on. I had an opportunity last week, Friday, to be in one of the workshop where I was asked a question about, are we looking at Reliance as an organization? And the answer was yes. And these are some of the things I indicated that we are working behind to ensure that we put that kind of systems in place with the support from various stakeholders. So thank you very much for your attendance. We really appreciate it, working this journey with us, and also ensuring compliance from the, our applicant, the industry, regarding the requirements that will be put forward in the future. Thank you very much, Sandra. I'll hand over back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tbt. Now I'm going to be introducing Renata Amaral. Dr. Renata Amaral is an experienced international trade lawyer with an extensive and proven record of successful engagement at the World Trade Organization, bilateral and regional trade negotiations, domestic trade policy, and market access. Over the course of her over 15 years career, she has advised governments and private stakeholders on international trade matters with a focus on World Trade Organization law. Currently, she is serving as visiting scholar and adjunct professor at the American University Washington College of Law, where she co-directs the certificate program on WTO and U.S. trade law and policy. Dr. Amaral is the Trade and Good Regulatory Practices staff lead of the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence of the medical technology sector, and also serves as the lead of the Tier 1 that is related to good regulatory practices for the COVID-19 MDRC project. So without further ado, Renata, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sandra. It's a pleasure to be joining you today. It's early here in Washington. I know it's afternoon there, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share a presentation with you on good regulatory practices and technical barriers to trade. It's going to serve kind of an introduction of the panel I will moderate at 3:35 p.m. So any questions you have here, I'm happy to answer, but we are going to have also a more in-depth perspective of everything I'm saying as an introductory remarks here later on with someone from the WTO Secretariat and the Inquiry Point, Tbt Inquiry Point of South Africa. So I'm going to share my presentation here with you. I'm just putting presentation mode. Okay, I guess it's okay. So this presentation is divided into two parts, basically, good regulatory practice, and I'm going to connect it with technical barriers to trade, the agreement on technical barriers to trade of the World Trade Organization. So the idea here is to connect the regulatory side of the work with the trade side of the work. And I'm happy to answer to any questions you might have during the presentation or afterwards. So what we mean by good regulatory practice, the term GRP, good regulatory practice, speaks basically to the quality and consistency of the domestic rulemaking process. It refers precisely to the internal coordination, the domestic coordination and review process under which the government works to ensure that rules and regulations are crafted in an open, transparent, and participatory manner, and that outcomes are risk-based and grounded in the best available data. So when we're talking about good regulatory practice, we're really overseeing and looking to the rulemaking process of the countries internally, the domestic rulemaking process. We are not talking about creating new regulation or new standards. We are talking really about the process of creating regulations and standards, not necessarily creating new regulations. So three things that we believe it's really important to remember is that good regulatory practices are not about more regulation or less regulation. They are about facilitating better regulatory outcomes. So we are not creating anything new. We are talking about the process of creation and trying to make it more clear and facilitated. Political process make directional decisions, but good regulatory practice, the idea is to create a professional process to rulemaking that follows a specific political course set. So they achieve this by adhering to a transparent and participatory rulemaking process and to evidence-based decision-making. So good regulatory practices are a very important precursor of regulatory cooperation. Sandra mentioned to you, I'm leading the work of the Inter-American Coalition on regulatory convergence. So we're really looking about cooperation and convergence of regulations, of standards. Our understanding is that only quality regulatory outcomes avail themselves of regulatory cooperation opportunities. And what's regulatory cooperation, regulatory convergence? What do I mean by that? When we're talking about regulatory cooperation, we are talking about any interaction. It refers to any interaction between regulators from different countries that result in some form of cooperation, with a view of increasing efficiency while achieving the desired regulatory results. So we are not talking about converging necessarily the regulations of two countries or more countries. We are talking about exchange of experiences, some form of cooperation during the regulatory, the rulemaking process. During the when we have regulations or standards of different countries, we are talking about trying to put them together and put the regulatory professionals to negotiate together, to talk with each other. When I'm talking about convergence, then it's one step further. It is a form of cooperation, but when different countries decide individually to modify their existing or proposed regulatory frameworks to bring them to a closer alignment. So we are talking about one step further, about really aligning regulations of different countries. This can take place throughout the time. Of course, it needs time to happen, but the moment of drawing up regulations in the respective countries is often independent of each other and difficult to synchronize. So we are not talking necessarily about aligning all the process, but aligning results of the process, aligning the regulations, aligning where we are going to with the regulatory process, understanding that different countries have different internal domestic process and can take different it can take different time frames to achieve a result on regulations or standards. We also understand that what are the elements of good regulatory practice in general, and the elements that we are bringing here is a combination of OECD standards, of the best scenario we can have when we're talking about elements that constitute good regulatory practice. So issue a regulatory forecast, what we expect with good regulatory practice, better saying. So issue a regulatory forecast, have a national regulatory register, provide opportunity for public comment, publish evidence and conduct regulatory analysis, respond to stakeholder input, use quality data and sound science, employ risk-based approaches, conduct regulatory impact assessments, conduct pro-competitive analysis, assess the international impact of a regulation, use international standards as a basis for national regulations, conduct ex-post assessments of regulatory impacts, establish a central regulatory coordination body. So those are the elements we look forward to having when we are talking with different countries about good regulatory practice. So what's a very basic regulatory life cycle? We identify the need and set objectives for a regulation, gather that data and stakeholder input, public consultation, design the regulation, implement the regulation, and assess regulatory impact of the regulation. So it's a very basic cycle, but serves to any regulatory rulemaking process in a very good way. So what's important here is the implementation of good regulatory practice is a very significant step towards regulatory cooperation between countries, towards regulatory convergence. And the regulations being designed produce results that generate less cross-border rights. So the idea is to align the process so we can have more aligned outcomes, regulatory outcomes, and therefore reduce cross-border, and we're talking basically about international trade, reduce restrictions to trade at the end of the day. And I'm going to connect all those elements throughout my presentation. So good regulatory practice encompassing the use of regulatory impact assessments, stakeholder engagement, and ex-post evaluation are a critical tool in the hands of governments to ensure that the regulation achieves its objectives. Over the past several years, attention has grown for the trade costs. So I'm changing now to the trade side of my presentation. So over the past several years, attention has grown for the trade cost of regulatory divergence, of differences in regulations, many times they are unnecessary. They create unnecessary restrictions to trade because of specific certifications of countries, the specific labeling that maybe they are not necessary, and they, at the end of the day, they impose costs, higher costs to trade and restrictions. So diverging regulation may increase the cost of trade to goods and services across borders. And here I'm bringing a very recommendation that is very well known for those that work with good regulatory practice. It's a recommendation from OECD from 2012. This recommendation highlights a number of principles and tools that can help policymakers develop, implement, and update regulations that promote their policy goals in the public interest. This recommendation of 2012, it recognizes the importance of international regulatory cooperation for regulatory quality and the relevance of the tools of regulatory policy encompassing ex-ante regulatory impact assessment, stakeholder engagement, and ex-post evaluation after the implementation of a regulation, to base regulatory policy making on evidence, including the evaluation of the likely benefits, costs, and effects of regulation, and the consideration of the voice of the regulated, of the private sector most of the times. So here we just brought here an example. I'm bringing an example of the chapter of the agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, because this good regulatory chapter, practice chapter, is being used as a reference for other trade agreements. And it brings all the elements that I talked before on that we look forward to having when we're talking about good regulatory practice domestically and between countries. So central regulatory coordination body is many countries, most of the countries don't have a central regulatory coordination body, but it's the idea would be to have one and bring all the regulators together to coordinate their regulatory process together under a central regulatory coordination body. So it also, in this chapter of the trade agreement between United States, Mexico, and Canada, they bring requirements for internal consultation, coordination, and review, information quality, early planning, dedicated website, use of plain language, transparent development of regulations, expert advisory groups, regulatory impact assessment, final publication, retrospective review, suggestions for improvement, information about regulatory processes, annual report, encouragement of regulatory compatibility and cooperation, committee on good regulatory practice, contact points, dispute settlement. Each of the bullet points are one of the provisions of the good regulatory practice chapter of the agreement. And again, the reason why we brought this here in the presentation is because it's very complete and is being used as a reference for other trade agreements around the world. Now I'm going to use everything I've discussed until now and bring and connect to the trade world, to the trade side of the presentation. And I hope I make myself clear, but also, again, we're going to have a panel dedicated to that, and we're going to have someone from the WTO Technical Barriers to Trade division here joining us in a few moments. So when we talk about technical barriers to trade and within the WTO umbrella, the World Trade Organization umbrella of agreements, we're going to talk here about WTO general rules, non-tariff barriers to trade. What are those? What we are talking about when we talk about non-tariff barriers to trade, the coverage of the Tbt Agreement, technical barriers to trade agreement, main principles of the agreement, relevant provisions, and the EPing system of the WTO that is accessible to anyone. What are the general rules of the WTO? It's the only international body dealing with rules of trade between nations. Nowadays, 164 members. It provides the legal ground rules for international commerce, international trade. It brings binding commitments to keep trade policies within agreed limits of members and help trade flow as freely as possible. For example, by having provisions to remove obstacles, providing confidence, transparency, and predictability to international trade. What are non-tariff bearish trade? When we talk about non-tariff bearish trade, what does this mean? What does this encompass? So we are talking about technical measures, for example, standards, regulations, internal taxes or charges, customs rules and procedures, quantitative import restrictions, public procurement practices, subsidies, and related government supports, investment restrictions or requirements, transport regulations, of course, etc., etc. Here, we are going to focus only on technical measures, standards, regulations, not on the other elements. But non-tariff bearish trade can take different forms, and sometimes it's very hard to identify TBT measures. So over time, the World Trade Organization was created in 1995, but it is an institution that was built over time, starting with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947, after the World War, at the end of the World War II. And over time, the idea here is just that I want to tell you that over time, since the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and throughout the establishment of the WTO until nowadays, we have less and less tariff bearish trade and more non-tariff bearish trade. Regulations, standards, more and more they create obstacles to the international trade of goods. The coverage of the TBT agreement is basically the same of the non-tariff bearish trade that I just mentioned to you 2 slides ago. And the TBT agreement, it acts as an instrument to encourage members to use less trade restrictive approach to meet regulatory objectives. It harmonizes through the use of relevant international standards. So the agreement asks for members to use relevant international standards where they exist and do not create anything new if it's not necessary, provide transparency, and avoid and resolve trade disputes related to standards matters. The agreement safeguards against the use of technical requirements as disguised restrictions on trade and the development of inefficient technical requirements and procedures. The relevance of the World Trade Organization for good regulatory practice, so here linking both subjects. Unnecessary regulatory differences can impose costs that prevent business from engaging in trade. The WTO, the organization, plays an important role in supporting efforts to facilitate trade through regulatory cooperation among its members, offering a multilateral platform for dialogue among governments on trade rules and throughout the rule-making cycle. The disciplines of the TBT agreement can help contribute with effectiveness and efficiency of regulations through good regulatory practice. And the agreement also provides a unique multilateral transparency framework for regulations affecting the trade in goods. The main principles of the agreement is non-discrimination, avoidance of unnecessary barriers to trade, harmonization through the use of international standards, guides, recommendation, transparency, concepts of equivalence, of technical regulation, and mutual recognition of results of conformant assessment procedures. The three main provisions of the TBT agreement that we always highlight is Article 2.2, 2.3, and 2.4. Basically, those are those provisions talk about avoid the creation of unnecessary obstacles to trade, about less trade restrictive manner. Always look for less trade restrictive manner in trade, and I mentioned this before, Article 2.4, where technical regulations are required and relevant and international standards already exist, their completion is imminent, members shall use them, shall use the international standards that already exist or the relevant part of the standard that exists as a basis for their technical regulations. I'm going to be a little bit quicker, Sandra, because I see my time is almost up. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Okay. So we have some principles here to develop international standards. In the second bullet, I mentioned that you're going to have access to this presentation. So there is a specific document of the TBT committee that mentioned the principles to develop international standards based on the TBT agreement. The TBT agreement brings basic definitions on technical regulation, what's a technical regulation, what's a standard, and what's the conformity assessment procedure. Technical regulation is a document that lays down product characteristics or the related process and production methods, including the applicable administrative provisions with which compliance is mandatory. That's the part that I want you to memorize. Compliance is mandatory when we talk about technical regulation. When we talk about standards, compliance is not mandatory. And conformity assessment procedures, we are talking about the procedure used directly or indirectly to determine the relevant requirements in technical regulations or standards are fulfilled. So we are talking about the procedures. Major medical technology regulatory trade challenges. What we have noticed over time is that TBT agreement, the rules of the TBT agreement are not implemented with the most medical device regulators around the world. They are either not aware of the TBT agreement or not required to implement it by trade ministers. So there is a gap in communication in most of the countries between regulators and trade officials. So that's the gap we are trying to fulfill also with our work. And medical devices are many times improperly regulated as drugs, as the pharma sector. And that's also another confusion that we try to explain to when we make presentations and workshops like this one, and also to authorities from international organizations. And here, just to end my presentation, I just would like to introduce you to the EPING system. When we have Laura Locks from the WTO with us, not in the next panel, but the panel afterwards, you can ask about also the EPING system to him. The system is available to everyone. This is just a print screen of the. When you type EPING system WTO in Google, you're gonna see this page, and you can register here. Anyone can do it, register and receive alerts from other countries, other member countries of the WTO that inform new regulations that they are designing, and then we are fact trade. So you can establish your filters to receive daily updates on information of other WTO members. This is here just an example of filters I have used just to show you inquiry points, for example, of all the inquiry points. South Africa as well is here. It's in the system, so you have access to any inquiry point of other countries. And here I end my presentation, Sandra. And if we don't have time for questions now, we can also address them in the panel. It's up to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renata. And I don't see any question at this point in time, but probably I would like to challenge you a little bit to share with all of us in one sentence why good regulatory practices are relevant for the medical technology sector.
I think the medical technology sector is a sector that has normally a very long supply chain. Imagine if each of the countries that are involved in a supply chain of equipment decide to have their own requirements, their own labeling requirements, their own certification requirements. Imagine how hard it is to make trade flow between, like along all the supply chain. So I think good regulatory practices are really important, especially cooperation between regulations and maybe convergence, because then we don't create regulations or standards where they already exist, they're not necessary, and then we avoid restrictions and obstacles to trade that we see so often in this sector and in other sectors as well, but the medical device sectors is very common to see certifications, labeling, or other requirements that are not necessary, and they are creating restrictions and maybe impeding trade, no? And of course, onerating and creating more costs where they're not necessary. So I think this is really important that we connect the dots to avoid complications to regulators, to trade officials, and to the private sector especially.
Thank you very much. So probably it's a little bit like good regulatory practices and access to medical technology are kind of like going hand in hand. Could it be?
Exactly.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I know we are a little past our time, so we have a question in here that I would like to reserve then for the next panel, if it is okay with you, Renata. And then I would like to thank you so much, Renata. So now I would like to welcome Dr. Tbt to moderate our next panel, where we're going to be talking about international benchmarks for medical device regulatory frameworks and authorities, and we're going to be starting talking about health references and recommendations. So, Dr. Tbt, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I think there are some questions on the chat, but possibly we can attend to that to maybe answer them as we go with the proceedings or towards the end. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention, that the questions are placed on the chat by our colleagues. So
okay,
I will, okay, thank you very much. So I will move on to the next session of the day, which is focusing on the good regulatory practices, good reliance practices, as well as the looking at the WHO global framework that is being published. I think everyone has been aware that it's being published and it's currently under review. So on this panel, I have Ms. Agnes Sitakijo, and I'll also introduce later one of the colleagues from SAPRA, but I will read the background of Ms. Kijo, and I really firstly like to thank her for all the support that she's been giving to us as SAPRA, as a national regulatory authority in various aspects of regulations. So Ms. Agnes Kijo is a pharmacist, and she has a master's in pharmaceutical technology, and she has an amount of 21 years over experience in regulations of both medicines and medical device, including in vitro diagnostics, at both at national and international level. She was previously a manager at the TFDA, the Tanzania National Regulator of Authority, and the first chair of the Africa Medical Device Forum, where she has achieved in her leadership there a lot of milestones that were set for the Africa Medical Device Forum. And she's currently working at the WHO headquarters in Switzerland under the Facilitated Product Introduction, the FPI team, as a technical officer, and her responsibility includes in some of them collaborative registration, which being the core collaborative registration procedure for in vitro diagnostics and medical device. So I'd just like to give a warm welcome to Ms. Agnes Kijo to joining us in this workshop. Thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Ms. Agnes Gijo to proceed with her presentation or the discussion that she wants to share with us today. Thank you. Agnes.
Thank you very much, Demakatso, for the introduction. I'm very honored to be here. Many thanks to the organizers, including Sandra and the team, for extending the invitation to WHO and especially the FPI team. So my presentation this afternoon really is about the recently published Good Regulatory Practice guidance document. And I'm happy that the previous speaker was emphasizing on this particular aspect on how important good regulatory practices is for effective regulation of medical devices and IVDs. And so I will speak about the Good Regulatory Practice document, which was published last year, November, and 3 other important tools that supports NRAs to strengthen regulatory systems. These tools are applicable for all medical products, but I will focus more on medical devices, including in vitro diagnostics. Next slide, please. So I will start with this introductory slide that reflects on the existing challenges to access medical products globally, which is in many ways contributed by inadequate regulatory capacity and lack of collaboration and work sharing in regulating medical products between countries, and especially medical devices and IVDs, understanding that in most regulatory authority, there is a lot of work that has been done on the side of other medical products such as pharmaceuticals and vaccines, but medical devices and IVD has always been lagging behind. And so to address such challenges, and based on a request from member states through the World Health Assembly Resolution 67.20 of 2014, WHO has developed many important tools to support NRAs in building effective and efficient regulatory systems. But as I mentioned on my previous submission, that I will speak only on 4 tools. So the major one is the Good Regulatory Practice Guidance document. Next slide, please. So this is a very important, tool that provides recommendations to regulators on how to set up effective national regulatory systems. And the purpose of establishing the WHO Good Regulatory Practice document is really to present high-level principles so that there is consistency in terms of how the regulators will be introducing regulatory systems. But it forms also or serves as a basis to benchmark, or as a benchmark to NRAs when they are introducing regulatory systems. And it is relevant in terms of the scope, relevant to all regulators, irrespective of maturity, irrespective of the resources or the regulatory model that is to be adopted. And it can also be relevant to, for example, policymakers, regulatory network. We understand these days, even on the medical devices side, there are many existing regulatory networks, which is very good in terms of advancing the regulatory work for medical devices and IVDs. Next slide, please. So what are the objectives of the WHO or good regulatory practices? The main objectives are about 6. So one is to ensure that there is sound and effective regulation of medical devices all across. As I mentioned in my previous slide, that there is a need of consistency regardless of the resources. Higher quality regulation and better regulatory decision-making and compliance. More efficient regulatory systems and better public health outcomes all across also, regardless of the region and regardless of the maturity of the national regulatory authority. And of course, to be able to have updated regulatory systems, but also to promote trust among regulatory authorities and other stakeholders. I will speak to a concept of recognition and reliance, which is actually built on a foundation called trust. If there is no trust, then there is no recognition, and then there is no reliance as well. So I will speak to that in my next slides. And then it also facilitates international cooperation. And the good regulatory practices, I'm still on the previous slide, Sandra. So the good regulatory practices is complemented also by other tools or other guidance documents that have been developed by WHO, including the good governance practices, good review practices that outlines best practices in reviewing documents, good reliance practices that I'm going to talk about later, and quality management system for regulatory authority, which has also been launched recently. Next slide, please. So the good regulatory practice guidance document is guided by 9 principles that are highlighted in this slide, but also a number of enablers to support the regulatory systems strengthening. So when good regulatory practices principles and enablers are embedded within the national regulatory or the regulatory systems, or the different components of the regulatory systems, that is when NRAs should expect to have regulatory impact in terms of the efficiency, in terms of the reduced timelines. And I think this is one of the things that is a pain point, especially as far as trade is concerned. And so once there is effectiveness in the regulatory systems, then you will expect to see effectiveness in terms of the regulatory output and also impact, and even in terms of accessibility of these important products. And so, and I wanted to give an example of one principle, which is flexibility, which played a critical role during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the expectation is for regulators to introduce the proposed principles and enablers progressively based on the availability of resources. And let me say also that the next tools that I'm going to present for you have also included or have taken into consideration the principles that are highlighted in the good regulatory practices document. So this is like a mother document, and the rest of the tools have addressed bits and pieces of the GRP principles. I will not go into the details, but I'm sure if you go through the slides, you'll be able to link or to go through each of the principles, but also the GRP. I have also provided a link in the previous, on the second or third slide. And so please find time to go through the GRP guidance document to get more details. Because at this point, I think I'm bounded by time. I cannot discuss further on this particular important, very important topic. And so the next tool that I want to speak about, which has actually picked some of the elements of the good regulatory practices, is the good reliance practices guidance document. Next slide, please. And next. So what are the principles of reliance or good reliance practices? So maybe before I speak on the other aspects, just to define that when you speak about reliance, this is an act whereby the regulatory authority in one country takes into account and gives significant weight to the assessment performed by another regulatory authority or trusted institution such as WHO, or to any other authoritative information in reaching its own decision. So there are various forms of reliance approaches, which I'm going to touch in the next slides. But aim really is to make sure that to make best use of the available resources and expertise. Even if, for example, if it's at the regional level, if at the country level, and avoid duplication and concentrate on regulatory efforts and resources where it is most needed. And I think these are some of the points that you would hear a lot of complaints from other stakeholders, that there is a lot of duplication of work among the regulatory authorities. variability in terms of the requirements and things like that. And so the aim really is to promote more efficient approach to regulatory oversight, but also to promote trade and thereby improving access to the needed products. And I think also Renata spoke about the issue of international cooperation and collaboration, which is also very, very essential to ensure that products continue circulating in all markets, continue to be safe. But I think it's important also to realize that no regulatory authority is able, even those that are best resourced, are able to carry out all the activity alone. And so there is a need for international cooperation. There is a need to adopt best practices. There is a need to use effectively the limited resources to where it is most needed, instead of duplicating regulatory activities. Next slide, please. And so the good reliance practices also has several concepts. I've spoken a little bit about how defined what reliance is, but there is also another formalized approach, which is called recognition. Which is a formalized approach to reliance. This is where a country or national regulatory authority recognizes the final decision by another regulatory authority or trusted institution with no additional assessment. For reliance, there is an additional assessment or oversight by the national regulatory authority in terms of the assessment reports. But for recognition, it is recognizing the final decision that has been made by another regulatory authority. And so this approach, actually, recognition, was widely used, especially at the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, where nobody or many regulators were not aware or did not have the right expertise to assess assays for COVID-19. And there are a lot of other challenges in terms of even how to evaluate the technical files for COVID assays and things like that. So many regulators introduced or adopted recognition or for recognizing the final decision from other mature national regulatory authority or WHO through the WHO listed products. And then also there is an issue of unilateral or mutual. So when you're adopting or you have adopted reliance practices, it can either be unilateral or mutual, but it applies also throughout the life cycle of a medical product. And so at any stage of a medical device life cycle, reliance can be applicable. It is also based on risk. Of course, even the regulatory framework is suggested to be risk-based, but also reliance is risk-based when one decide, for example, to take to rely on a specific type of products or source of a particular products, the level of assessment of a particular products. One may decide to adopt a risk-based approach on how to register or to allow products to go into their country. And of course, at the regional level, also regional reliance mechanisms do also exist. And I will give examples on my next slide. So in this particular slide, next slide, please. So in this particular slide, I have highlighted some examples of reliance in the medical devices field. So I think one very popular reliance example is the WHO collaborative registration procedure between WHO national regulatory authorities and manufacturers. And so this involves exchange of information or assessment reports of a product that has been pre-qualified by WHO with the national regulatory authority, with the expectation of a product to be registered or for a regulatory decision within 90 days. And then I have provided also a link where you can also go through and get more information on the collaborative registration procedure for in vitro diagnostics, which is quite new. It started only in 2019 as a pilot, and now 22 countries have joined the collaborative registration procedure for IVDs, including also SAPRA. And then a bridged pathway for approved medical devices with approval from the regulatory authorities. So this is also another example of Reliance, which is practiced in Australia. And then the WHO EUL facilitated procedure, which was also introduced at the time of pandemic, but this is very specific for COVID assays. But the time for the regulatory decision was drastically reduced to 15 days, understanding that we were in the middle of pandemic. And then a very successfully Thai FDA and Singapore HSA regulatory reliance for specific number of IVDs. And so I think this has triggered a lot of other Asian countries to also get interested to join reliance mechanisms. But I think there is also another example on reliance system for a group of countries. So this is from the, it's called Medical Devices Single Audit Program, MDSAP, which has been developed under the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum. So this is for, very advanced or mature national regulatory authorities, including Australia, Brazil, Canada, Japan, and the rest. And so the program permits an auditing organization to conduct a single regulatory audit that satisfies the requirements of the regulatory authorities. And I think this is where it becomes important that even the requirements are harmonized to allow such kind of reliance mechanisms to work. And so it satisfies the regulatory audit that satisfies the requirements of the regulatory authorities that participate in the program. The pooled resources are used to establish and maintain oversight of the auditing organization, resulting in a more effective use of limited regulatory resources rather than each of these regulatory authorities to conduct their own audits in the same manufacturing site. Then just a single institution would coordinate the inspections or the audit, and the reports is shared among the IMDRIF member states. So this is just an example of how effective regulatory decision can be when approaches such as reliance are adopted by either a country or a specific group of countries. Next slide, please. I'm going to also speak a little bit on another tool. Next slide, please. On the third tool, that is the regulatory systems strengthening activities. So WHO's support to strengthening regulatory system is divided into two main areas. So the first is capacity building, and then the second one is promoting smart regulation. On capacity building part, we conduct training and specialized technical assistance. And on smart regulation, it involves development of guidance documents, tools such as the global benchmarking tool, and then promotion of harmonization and convergence among the national regulatory authorities, regulatory flexibility and agility. As I mentioned earlier, that the principles of the good regulatory practices applies also to the rest of the tools that I'm speaking about now. That just in summary, there is a lot of work that we do to support strengthening of regulatory systems at the country and in regional level. So please, as mentioned by Demarcato, we have been working very closely with Demarcato and team to see how best we can bring up regulatory framework for medical devices and IVDs. And I truly believe that SAPRA is going to make huge steps in the next maybe few years in this area of work. Next slide, please. So the objective of the WHO Regulatory System Strengthening Program really is to build regulatory capacity in the member states. As I mentioned earlier, that this was based on a request or a response to the call by the member states through the World Health Assembly Resolution 67.2. And so the objective is to build regulatory capacity in member states, which is consistent to good regulatory practices, but also to promote cooperation, convergence, and transparency through networking, work sharing, and reliance. And on this particular slide, I wanted to just brief you on the work that has recently been done on the WHO benchmarking tool revision 6. Revision 6 covers only it's in past tense now, so covered only medicines, vaccines, and blood products. But to date, we have a global benchmarking tool plus medical devices. So it also covers indicators to assess regulatory systems for medical devices and IVD. So the revision of the tool to integrate the medical devices and IVDs indicators into the GBT was initiated end of last year. The work involved a huge number of working group members, and I believe also SAPRA participated. The discussion started from 1st of September 2020 to June 2021, and then there was a lot of editorial work, and it was published in Q4. I realized that I have not provided a link on my slide, but I will make the necessary amendments before I send the final version to you. And so we have successfully conducted already one pilot in Kenya, and we expect also to conduct a second one possibly in Cuba in Q3. So this is the progress, and my call to SAPRA also is to go through the GBT plus medical devices tool, and you can use this tool to sort of assess the level where you are in terms of the implementation of the requirements for medical devices as suggested by the tool. And I think one of the key points that I want to raise here, when developing the medical devices indicators for the GBT, the WHO Global Model Regulatory Framework was the main reference document. So whatever recommendation that is proposed in the Global Model Regulatory Framework, all the important recommendations and elements are reflected also in the GBT plus medical devices. So please also find time to go through this very important and innovative tool to sort of gauge where you are and what are the gaps that SAPRA might have in order to bring up the level of regulation of medical devices and IVD to the next maturity level. So the last, and I know I'll just have to be a little bit quick. I have a few more slides to go. So the next and final tool is the WHO Global Model Regulatory Framework, which has recently been, or is currently going a very thorough review to include important components, understanding that this is a tool that was developed about 7 years ago. Next slide, please. It was published in 2017, and yes, there is ongoing review. A very good document, very practical document for member states. It recommends basic regulatory controls towards an expanded level, so only 2 phases from basic to expanded level. And of course, it describes the roles and responsibilities of the National Regulatory Authority, taking into consideration also the principles, the 9 principles of the GRP, but also elements of reliance. It also promotes the issue of reliance and recognition. And of course, the ongoing review was to expand some of the topics and to introduce also very new topics to further guide the National Regulatory Authority. For example, we have been receiving a lot of requests or questions on UDI, unique device identification. We've been receiving questions on new technology, software as medical devices, and of course, the element of implementation and other regulatory pathways that I'm going to touch on my next slide. So the trigger rather for the revision, if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so in this particular slide, I'm not going to take time here, but this slide is just to indicate what were the rationale or what triggered revision of the Global Model Regulatory Framework. So you would also be able to see what were the triggers, but really to make sure that the Global Model Regulatory Framework continues to or catch up with the rapidly changing field of medical devices because of the advancement in this area. And so there was a need after 7 years to have this guidance document updated. Next slide, please. So outline of the revised global model regulatory framework based on the discussion, extensive discussion that we have done with regulators. We had about 45 national regulatory authorities participating in the working group discussion to revise the global model regulatory framework, heavy involvement in all regulators from all regions. We went through the first round of public consultation May, June, and now we have published for a second round of public consultation to continue receiving important feedback from especially NRAs and of course industry. We expect to have this document discussed by the WHO expert committee in October, and for a possible publication end of October, and publishing, I think, during the World Health Assembly in May 2023. So the aspects that have been included in the revised global model regulatory framework include, of course, we have updated in all the sections, but I think most important is the inclusion of two more important additional topic, which includes the regulatory pathways, and also on the implementation. There are very good information that have been included to further guide regulators on how to approach some of the aspects, including also nice diagrams and process flow charts, so that regulators are able to easily understand what is the concept and what is the pathway that they need to navigate through when introducing a regulatory framework for medical device. So I will stop here, and thank you very much for listening. And I understand I had apologized to Sandra that I will not be able to stay longer than that, but I will be happy to respond to all the questions in writing, and I hope the organizers will be able to send back the responses to all participants in this call. So with that, I thank you and hand it over back to Demakatso.
Thank you very much, Agnes. That was quite a comprehensive information that you have shared with us. You know, and as you have indicated that you you don't have enough time, but thank you very much for making time for us. So, you know, I've just captured some notes, and then I hope everybody also has captured some of the information that you have shared with us. So I'm using two screens and I'm realizing I'm looking at the other screen. So, you know, we're talking about the good regulatory practices. We're looking at quality, we're looking at consistency, and also, you know, the measure on how to facilitating the implementation of efficient regulatory system in our country, and that will assist in not only in South Africa, but other regulatory authority. And, you know, when you spoke about the good reliance practices, the examples that you gave, which are live examples that make sense, you know, if you are in this industry, the examples that you make regarding the MDSEP, which is already in the medicine side, and now it's coming to the medical side, it will help us as a regulator to, you know, start looking at how do we resource the regulator moving forward, so that we ensure that the compliance that we request to the industry, it's aligned to that, so that, you know, when we're looking at what kind of resources we need internally, it's not overworking on the regulator. You know, you spoke about agility, and, you know, this kind of information sharing and ability to, you know, participate and be part of these various working groups, and, you know, being part of, you know, WHO, for examples, it will assist us, because there was a question that was asked about, you know, adaptability and changing of decisions. And this speaks to what you have indicated on agility. So I just wanted to highlight, I hope the person who asked the question was actually answered, to say, you know, when we're making regulatory science-based decision, we're also thinking about access and the time that we take to make those decisions. So by that, making that statement, I was hoping that person who asked the question was also answered. And also, you know, the tool, the WHO GBT tool, it's very interesting, and it's a tool that we'll look into as SAPRA to prepare ourselves as a medical device unit, because our medicines and the vaccine unit are already, implementing that. And we'll use the tool to prepare ourselves for that audit from our side as well. So it helps, and then the link, if you share with us, the industry will also know what is being looked at. So when we request that you need to comply to this, is not something new. So I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate the information that you have shared. It's valuable information, and I hope everyone learned and listened to what has been shared. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I understand that you have to leave. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Best wishes.
So at Sandra, I think we can release Agnes, unless she wants to stay a little bit for some of the discussion, but I just thought, let me capture this before the end, as she indicated that she would like to leave. Maybe you want to say something before Agnes leave. Thank you very much, Sandra. Hand over to you.
Thank you very much, and just joining Dr. Mative, thanking you for the effort of joining us today. So thank you very much, Agnes. And if we receive any question, of course, we're going to be forwarding it to you. So back to you, Dr. Mative, for our next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our next panelist is Ms. Kanyisile Nkuku. She's one of the team members in the medical device unit. Kanyisile has been with the unit for some time now. She's a pharmacist, and she is also currently just finished her master's here at Wits University. And as I indicated, she has experience in clinical trials, also experience in licensing and regulations. As I indicated, she's one of our few colleagues who has been part of the medical device unit with SAPRA for a number of years. So I think she'll be the best candidate to speak to the topic at hand. So Kanyisile, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dimaka. So good afternoon, everyone. I will be presenting on behalf of SAPRA, and my presentation is going to be looking at the three documents, but also taking into consideration African regulatory authorities, and taking a deep dive into SAPRA as a regulatory authority and how Reliance has worked in terms of our regulation, and how we aim to use the three documents going forward for medical device registration, as well as currently in licensing. The table of content, as I've said, I'll be diving more into African regulatory authorities. I'll be discussing a background, looking at the medical device regulatory approval gaps within Africa, regulatory harmonization of medical devices in Africa, the challenges as well as advantages of regulatory harmonization of medical devices in Africa, the way forward for medical device registration, and an overview of SAPRA's role with regulation of medical devices, taking into consideration the three documents which was discussed by Dr. Agnes. Medical devices play a major role in health systems. They are needed to address the burden of disease, economic challenges, infrastructure of African nations, and rather than using medical devices that were designed for the needs and resources of high-income countries, we need to ensure that the regulation of medical devices that we align with within Africa, that they are taking into consideration the barriers that we face as regulatory authorities within Africa, but also relying on other more advanced regulatory authorities. Regulation of medical devices has become increasingly complex with the globalization of product development, product production, supply, and rapid pace of technological and social change in the context of limited financial and human resources. As mentioned previously by Dr. Agnes, the World Health Assembly 67.2 support and actually state that we need to improve our regulatory systems in order to ensure that we have the required resources and also the regulations in order to approve a regulatory products within countries that are safe for use. There are key documents that were previously discussed by Dr. Agnes, which I will also be just giving a brief on, just so everyone also knows what documents that I am referring to when I'm talking about the gaps and challenges, as well as the advantages that African regulatory authorities need to be cognizant of. The first document is the Global Medical Regulatory Framework for Medical Devices. And this document provides guidance, support on how to develop, implement regulatory controls which are relating to medical devices. It also provides guidance to jurisdictions that are continuing to improve their regulatory frameworks as they take steps to ensure the quality and safety of medical devices available in their countries. The second document, which was also discussed, is the good regulatory practice. And in this document, there are key principles which were highlighted and were previously discussed, which is legality, consistency, independence, impartiality, proportionality, clarity, flexibility, efficiency, and transparency. With all these principles that are in this guidance document, we can be able to ensure that we are aligned to good regulatory practices and ensure that whenever we are designing or implementing regulation and documents within the regulatory authority, they are aligned to good regulatory practice. The last document is good reliance practice. And this is to elaborate more on the reliance on the work of other regulatory authorities to eliminate or reduce efficient duplication of regulatory evaluations of medical products, inspections, audits, and of facilities. And there are a few pillars that I would like to discuss in terms of reliance. And the first one is convergence, which was also previously highly elaborated by the two previous speakers. Why is convergence and harmonization so important? These are enablers of good regulatory practice in terms of collaborating and sharing of information. And there is one particular pillar of reliance that is super essential and that most regulatory authorities have not taken into consideration when we talk about reliance, and this is work sharing. An example I give is within the African context, if African regulatory authorities, one which is also a developing country, but it is more equipped and it is more forward in terms of regulating medical devices, they can share their reviews and evaluations of similar medical devices that different applicants are submitting within their countries. And this will increasingly reduce workload and also duplication, and will also ensure that there is an easier access and timely access of products within countries in Africa, as we know that Africa suffers from a great burden of certain diseases such as HIV and TB, and there's quite a lot of other diseases that we suffer from. And sharing work whereby in terms of IVDs and HIV test kits, we can ensure that there's timely access to these HIV test kits in each and every country where they are disease burdened by HIV, instead of a HIV test kit taking 5 years for approval because the supplier is not able to provide the regulatory authority with the information that they need that another regulatory authority already has. When we look at the approval gaps within regulatory authorities within Africa, many of the gaps are due to lack of resources, lack of legislation to regulatory skills, the lack of political will, lack of trust amongst African countries. And in terms of lack of trust, this is highly highlighted when you look at the different stringent regulatory authorities that different African regulatory authorities rely on. There isn't any African country that African regulatory authorities rely on. However, we can rely on one another as African regulatory authorities, and the lack of trust is shown among that we don't rely on each other. There's also lack of accessible information and confidentiality of information. There's lack of regulatory alignment of product risk classifications and inconsistent practices regarding product notifications in the area of medical devices. And lastly, it's in the level of detail in regulatory reports and different levels of competencies. And this was seen in terms of SAPRA when we were doing the reviews for COVID-19 test kits, whereby different reports, technical reports that were coming through for us to review, some of them did not have the information that was required, and some of them had all the information that was required. And you can actually see that the original manufacturer was using WHO framework as a guideline to provide the documents. Regulatory harmonization of medical devices within Africa. In terms of the African countries, we do have NEPAD, which has been encouraging regulatory strengthening amongst regulatory authorities, and it has been coordinating with ANDF and also the WHO in order to ensure and facilitate regulatory coordination and cooperation amongst authorities. We also have, when you look at the TFDA, which is currently way ahead of SAPRA, and SAPRA will be also discussing with TFDA on how they can assist us when we start registration, which shows that there is trust amongst regulatory authorities. And we are taking the guidance documents that have been published to ensure that we also, there is a timely approval of products within the country. By looking at that, SAPRA has as well taken into consideration the Global Harmonization Task Force classification guideline, which shows that we are enabling the authority by relying on guidance documents that have been already published to ensure that we don't recreate the work that is already done, but only modifying it to best fit the country's needs. WHO has echoed the need and advantages for African authorities to convergence in order to ensure timely availability of affordable, safe, and quality medical devices. When we look at the challenges and of regulatory harmonization, as well as the harmonization, the advantages, many of the challenges are some of the gaps which I've already outlined, which was lack of accessible information, and also of confidential information, lack of regulations, lack of resources, lack of regulatory alignment of product risk classifications, and also different levels of competencies. However, when you look at the advantages, they are more beneficial than all these challenges that we are facing, which can be overcome by all the documents that have already been published by WHO, such as the framework, as well as the good reliance practice and regulatory practice, which have been published. And the advantages is the decreased regulatory burden, decreased workload on regulatory authorities, an increase in the quality of regulatory decisions, and most importantly, timely access to safe, efficacious, and quality assured medical devices. The way forward for medical device regulation in Africa is that, as echoed by the first speaker, that Reliance does not represent a less stringent form of regulatory oversight, nor is it an outsourcing of regulatory mandates or a compromise to independence for regulatory authorities. Agencies should implement quality measures as well as monitoring systems, such as updating their IT infrastructure that will enable sharing of data amongst regulatory authorities. The proactive engagement of different stakeholders from the medical device industry as partners in the implementation of the regulations will also be beneficial, and also inclusion of Reliance-related provisions by national regulatory authorities as part of the flexible regulatory pathways is also encouraged and should be considered for all regulatory functions over the medical device product life as appropriate. When we look at an overview of SAPRA's role in terms of regulation of medical devices and how we are taking the 3 documents into application, the current status of medical devices is that SAPRA is currently licensing establishments according to ISO 13485, and we have licensed over 2,413 establishments have been issued with licenses. And in our licensing, we are doing a product listing whereby applicants will be listing all their products. And when they're listing their products for class C and D, we have been very strict to say that they need to provide us with evidence of approval from one of the 6 Reliance jurisdictions that we are relying on, such as US FDA, TGA EU, and for IVDs, there's also WHO pre-qualified. However, while we're still doing the licensing, the registration might not have yet commenced, but we have updated our medical device regulation to align with other regulatory authorities, and also have taken as a form of guidance for us when we're updating these regulations. And once our regulations have been implemented, we'll then be calling up medical devices for registration, as our caller plan is still in draft. When we dive deeper into the current activity that is the core focus, which is licensing, we have 3 different types of licensing, which is our manufacturer, which focuses on manufacturing, packing, labeling, so import, export, distribute, and a wholesaler that focuses on storage, transportation, and delivery. And for all 3, the main important reliance method that we're doing is that for all high-risk medical devices, which are class C and D, they need to have proof of proof of approval or registration from another jurisdiction that we rely on, that is listed on our application form. And there was a question previously on the chat that asked if the product listing by SAPRA, is it a good regulatory practice? And I will be answering that to say it is a good regulatory practice, because we are noting down, since we haven't started registration, what are the products that a company is actually responsible for. This way, it's important for us to then be able to control, and also when then we start product registration, to know that a company has been distributing, I'll give an example, a class D products like an HIV test kit, to say that Canisila's distribution company is responsible for this specific HIV test kit. And also now it provides a way for us to then have some sort of oversight when there are any vigilance reports that are coming in, any complaints that are coming in from a specific product. If also we find any illegal products in the market that do not have any license holder to that specific product. So it is part of good regulatory practice as a regulator to have an oversight of products within your country, and also to ensure that when you are licensing your specific licensees, that they abide by all the laws in terms of registration, which is our act, to ensure that they are licensed accordingly, and in this case, licensed according to Section 22C of the Act. And in terms of SAPRA engagements on how we are using Reliance, SAPRA currently has forged partnership and has memorandum of understanding with regulatory authorities such as Anvisa in Brazil, such as US FDA, Swissmedic, and also Health Singapore. And we are also in communication and working with government entities such as the Trade and Industry Unit. We also have regional engagements with the Africa Medical Device Forum, and we are a SEDC member as a regulatory authority. And currently the Senior Manager of Medical Devices is a co-chair of the AMDRF, and we are an active participant. And this is to ensure that whatever guidelines that are being drafted within SAPRA, that we align them with international guidelines that are out there in place, such as the WHO guidelines. And also being part of AMDRF, we can also interact with other African regulatory authorities and actually work share, and also they can provide assistance to us where we need assistance, and we can also assist them where they need assistance in order for us to not duplicate work, and also ensure that we have a good oversight of any of the regulations and documents that we draft as SAPRA. We are also part of the working group for WHO, where we review guidelines, and we also participate in this working group. And also, as a highlight, we are also going to be involved in the CRP process for IVDs, whereby SAPRA will be inviting local manufacturers to come forward and also be part of the WHO CRP process for a pilot pre-qualification of IVDs. So this shows that SAPRA is definitely open and willing to engage with industry in terms of ensuring that our legislative document, which is the Act, our medical device regulations, that are in line, and they also take into cognition what international regulatory authorities have to ensure that whatever multinational companies guidance they need, they can be able to know that SAPRA is a member of MTRF, and whatever challenges that they may have, we'll be able to then also get assistance where we can't find a common ground from other regulatory authorities. And we are having workshops with industry to ensure that there's clear communication and dialogue, and where we can be flexible in terms of our regulations. And we are also having technical working groups and updating our guidance documents, and also having applicant meetings. And we also have expert engagements with academic institutions, scientific organizations, as well as healthcare professionals on how we can guide them. So the question is, why Reliance? Why should regulatory authorities be all about Reliance? A well-established regulatory authorities should collaborate with other authorities to expedite IVDs, as well as medical device legislation and policy frameworks where it does not exist. And this is to also identify areas where we need refinement to existing ones, where it is already in place. The important thing is that African agencies do not need to implement policies from scratch. However, they can adopt from organizations such as IMDRF and also WHO guidance documents that are already in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kanye. Thank you very much, Kanyisile, for the update and also sharing the position of SAPRA regarding the Reliance and our approach towards the good regulatory practice. We still have some milestones to reach and still have a way to go regarding the implementation of the medical device, the Reliance project that we have, as Kanye has just given a brief. And we will continue engaging the industry regarding the process that we follow, not only focusing on international importers and exporters, and also taking into consideration the local manufacturers of medical device and IVDs, and including them in the communication regarding compliance and the regulatory requirements. So thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. And as I have indicated, once Agnes has finished her topic regarding the good reliance practice, and we're closing it with the position of SAPRA. Thank you very much, Kanye, for putting that forward. So from that side, Sandra, I would like to hand over back to you, but just to say thank you. I was checking on the questions, but I think that all the questions has been answered. So I'll hand over back to you. Thank you very much, Sandra.
Thank you very much, Nimakatso and Kanisile. So then we're ready to our next and final panel for today. So we are turning the floor to Renata so she can help us moderate our very final panel today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you very much for this excellent panel. Now we're going to have a panel with two very distinguished speakers. I believe Lauro is already with us. I don't see Charles, but he might be connecting at any point. Our panel will be on international benchmarks for medical device regulatory frameworks and authorities, trade and legal references, and obligations. I would like to introduce you to Lauro. It's a huge pleasure, Lauro, to have you with us. Lauro Lopes has been working with the Secretary of the World Trade Organization located in Geneva, Switzerland since 2002. He's currently legal counselor at the WTO's Trade and Environment Division, where he provides legal and policy assistance with respect to trade and environment issues, as well as matters related to the Tbt Agreement, standards and technical regulations, including assisting dispute settlement panels involving these matters. Lauro, thank you so much again. I'm a huge fan of your work for decades, as you know, so it's really a pleasure to have you join us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Renata, and I hope I will be able to do justice to all your exaggerated compliments. But let me just share my screen, my presentation, so bear with me just 1 second. Let's see, I always get this wrong, hopefully. Can you see?
Nadia, yeah, now we can. Are you able to put in the presentation mode?
Yeah, let me put in
Mhm.
presentation mode. I think it should be in order now.
Excellent. It's perfect. Thank you.
And can I ask you, Renata, and then actually, hi everybody. Before anything else, I think it's afternoon there as well. I think we have the same time, no? Although I
Yes,
think
South
I
Africa,
think it's
yes.
much colder in South Africa than here in Geneva. And Renata, may I ask you? It may sound a little bit bizarre request, but if you can keep your video on while I'm speaking.
Okay. Sure,
Because for
sure,
me,
sure.
sometimes I feel, when we give out, especially after the pandemic, we're doing a lot of presentations and you don't see
I know.
anybody on the other side. So
No, I'll be here. I'll join you with my video on all the time. No problem.
okay. Believe me, it's not so I'm forcing you to pay attention because it helps
No,
me.
I completely understand. No worries.
Okay, so without further ado, let me just get started with my presentation. But actually, one final preliminary word is that my colleague Devin McDaniels was supposed to give this presentation, but for reasons beyond his control, he cannot make it. So I hope he would probably have made a much better presentation than me because he's been working even more closely with these matters of medical devices. But let's see if I can do justice to him. So I understand I have like 25 minutes, half an hour to present, and then we're going to have 15 minutes for Q&As. So I will proceed with this understanding. The idea here, because I listened a little bit to previous presentations, and I think that there will be a little bit of repetition, but I don't think actually it's a problem because some of the issues that were spoken in terms of the importance of harmonization and cooperation and mutual recognition, all these elements that were mentioned in the previous presentations in a more practical sense. I will present them as pillars of the Tbt Agreement. So actually, my message here is to reinforce the same message that was already given in previous presentations, now from the point of view of the Tbt Agreement. So hopefully in my presentation, I want to address these 3 points here. They are, of course, we have limited time, but I think in that the Tbt Agreement is about much more than this. But I think they are very important elements concerning the topic of good regulatory practice and medical devices. And then I will be happy, of course, to complement or add anything in the Q&A part. But basically, my message here is that, and even before that, let me just, I'm not sure if all the, I think around 100 participants are familiarized with the Tbt Agreement in general, and apologize if I'm being too basic here. But basically, the WTO agreement contains a series of trade agreements on goods and services intellectual property. The big family of goods agreements that deal with trade in goods and products, include trade elements or disciplines in various angles of trade in products, including, and that's the objective of the Tbt Agreement, the agreement on technical barriers to trade. It deals with trading goods when trading goods are affected by domestic regulations, standards, conformity assessment procedures, which are not themselves necessarily addressing international trade, but they may affect and many times affect strongly international trade. So Tbt Agreement is kind of unique in terms, if you think about trade as a isolated topic, in the sense that it's concerned, the Tbt Agreement, the Agreement Technical Barriers to Trade, concerns measures themselves not about trade, but can affect trade. So measures that address public policy, quality, environment, safety of products, and encompasses a wide range of situations and products, including the topic of this event, medical devices. And the reasons why countries regulate medical devices can vary, but normally as you know better than me, is safety, quality, human health, etc. Okay, now the agreement basically is not about curtailing the freedom that countries have to regulate to protect their citizens. Is more about, first of all, reinforcing the message that countries are sovereign to regulate, but at the same time recognizing that if regulations are done excessively, not based on properly on science, on the best science, disproportionately and discriminatorily, this can affect trade and not necessarily will help the policy that was the reason of the measure. So the agreement strikes this balance between the freedom of regulate, the sovereign right to regulate in one hand, but also the need to do that in a manner that is not excessive, what we call more trade restrictive than necessary and disproportional. I'm being too theoretical here, but let me, as I proceed, perhaps you understand a little bit better. So that's the reason of the agreement, and now, and that's the reason why I'm still in the outline here, but I promise I will proceed a bit faster. The devil is always in the detail. Where the agreement has obligations concerning proportionality of the regulation, non-discrimination, etc. But of course, as I said, regulations can be very complex, and then countries may have differences between them, and there is a lot of potential of asymmetries, different ways that countries regulate the same risk or the same product. And the agreement has certain tools in its text, but also in its practice. And now I will address some of the points in this outline here that help in practice countries to produce measures, regulatory measures, including on medical devices that are optimal in terms of the health and quality outcomes, but also affect least trade or affect trade in a manner that is strictly necessary. Now, one mechanism, and this is the one point I want to address shortly, is the use of international standards as a benchmark to as a basis for regulation, because that ensures the quality of the regulation, but also more similarity of regulations across countries, and that makes it better for exporters, for example, that they will probably face similar regulatory environment across their export markets. But of course, regulations and products are dynamic. They happen all the time. Things change, new risks come. And many countries, in particular developing countries, they certainly have problem keeping up with the new technical requirements and changes and adaptations and updates in regulation. And that's the reason why, and that is point one that I want to mention, what we call trade and regulatory cooperation is vital for all areas of TBT, but including in particular essential medical products. By regulatory cooperation, I mentioned this at the broadest extent possible, and this is something the agreement and the committee, the TBT committee that was created to administer the agreement. It's one of the major contributions, because the agreement and this links to point 2.3 here in my outline, by encouraging transparency in terms of notification of draft measures, but also measures that can be discussed in the TBT committee, my point 3, and countries in a draft form, that countries can go there in a non-litigious way, in a cooperative way, discuss problems or doubts or questions they have, one country with the new regulation of the other country, including on medical devices. This can actually be not only an easy and non-litigious way, non-conflictual way to resolve problems, but also can be a type of a little learning lesson for even other countries that are not even involved in those discussions. So let's say South Africa wants to regulate a new regulatory agency wants to regulate a new risk with concerning a new medical device, but is complex and is a novel product. But then in the TBT committee, perhaps another country, it's just notified a measure regulating that same product. And that notification, which is not even adopted, it's a draft, is made available. You can read it, you can see as a model or not what they have done. Perhaps another country, not you, but another country raises questions about this proposed regulation in the TBT committee. And that discussion can also be a good source of ideas for you, who is also thinking to regulate in that area, to see mistakes or to avoid problems that were raised. So it's from that perspective that I think that my point one of the outline, I see the importance of the TBT agreement and the TBT committee in terms of cooperation and then eventually all this together can help not only open markets for exporters, but also can facilitate trade for the importing market, because if you have less regulation, unnecessary regulation, less red tape, you will have chances to have more access to essential medical products and devices. Sorry, I spent too much time in this outline, and I probably advanced too many things for the rest of my presentation, but I think it's with the hope that you will understand a little bit more from what I intend to do with my remarks. I won't spend too much time because I already advanced in the previous slide what I meant by regulatory cooperation. And see, here I list some of the benefits, but also let me highlight one of them. So I'm the kind of person that I'm not going to go for line to line and reading all lines, okay? So I will make available my presentation, and you can go back there and see the details. But I think I just want to highlight one point that in terms of regulatory cooperation. Again, by regulatory cooperation in TBT, I mean the disciplines and practices of the committee in the TBT that, for example, allow, as I mentioned, early notification of drafts. So everybody, all regulatory agencies and parliaments of all members can know in advance what other countries are regulating. Perhaps you want to regulate something similar. You can see that as an example. But also when you, because this is an obligation of transparency as well, when you notify your own proposal, there is another obligation in the agreement which says that you have to give opportunity for public consultations, which is actually beyond the obligation of the agreement because it's a practice in many countries. But to stakeholders in all WTO members, when you do that, of course, to comply with the obligation of the agreement, but in fact, and I heard this from some events that we held here in the WTO on good regulatory practice, and regulator from one developed country member said, from us, when we open for consultation, we open public consultation, we get ideas from different stakeholders, manufacturers, producers from the private sectors, NGOs, academia. We actually are receiving free advice, free scientific information that otherwise we would have to pay consultants to do for us. So it's actually a way to piggyback in the positive way from knowledge that if you would do that without this public consultation, which the TBT agreement requires, 60 days of opportunity to provide comments, you would have to perhaps incur in costs. So there is this other additional, of course, nothing's perfect, but I think there's this additional element, which also I think that falls into the umbrella of regulatory cooperation. So again, I don't think regulatory cooperation is just two government officials sitting together in a room discussing, or in the TBT committee. This is a type of engagement between stakeholders and the government. This is cooperation as well. You are not litigating, you're just receiving comments and reading those comments. I will go to the next presentation, next part, because I think that and I would like to spend a little bit more time here, I have 15 minutes, is on international standards, because I think other presentators mentioned harmonization. Again, why the Tbt Agreement puts so much emphasis on the use of international standards as a basis of regulations, standards, and conformity assessment procedures. The Tbt Agreement, just to recall, covers three types of measures, regulatory measures: technical regulations and standards. The two are identical in terms of their content. They are both documents that lay down product characteristics or production method, or deal with packaging, labeling requirements, marking requirements. The key difference is that whereas technical regulations are mandatory, compliance is mandatory, standards compliance is voluntary. Okay, the Tbt Agreement regulates disciplines both in a little bit different ways in terms of stringency, but they regulate discipline both. And there's a third type of conformity assessment, which I think is the most problematic, in particular for small and medium-sized enterprises and developing countries, is the conformity assessment procedures, the certification procedures put in place to certify that the product comply or not with the specifications. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, the use of international standards is not only strongly encouraged by the WTO, by the Tbt Agreement, but actually is an obligation. It's a qualified obligation because you have, as you will see now, some escape clauses, ways to escape the obligation, but it's a core obligation. So the agreement requires, if you are planning to regulate a sector, a product, a risk, and if there is already a relevant international standard, that standard should form the basis of your regulation. Unless, and here is the what I wanted to show you, unless the standard is ineffective, the international standards ineffective or inappropriate for your policy objective. So let's say there is an ISO international standard for some, medical device quality characteristic, but you want to go beyond that. So what they have there is not appropriate for your the level of protection or the policy level that you have set to yourself. So if that's the case, you don't need to use international standards, you can deviate. Okay, or it may be inappropriate or inappropriate because you are developing countries and the international standard requires the use of certain technologies and infrastructure that you don't have. Okay, and in fact, the Tbt Agreement, although it has this obligation with these qualifications, does recognize that developing countries may face precisely this type of challenge when they try to implement international standards, and they create extra flexibility for them in Article 12.4 of the Tbt Agreement, which is the part of the Tbt Agreement listing the so-called special differential treatment. Now, it's good that, of course, there is this type of flexibility, but of course, at the end of the day, ideally, all countries, independently of their developing, should base their regulations on international standards, not because the WTO or the TBT says, it's just because it makes sense in terms of a positive outcome point of view, precisely because, and nothing's perfect, of course, international standards which are developed in technical bodies outside the WTO and existed even before the WTO existed. The container, for example, the shipping container is an international standard. And when those dimensions became standardized, it revolutionized trade. It exists as an ISO standard even before the WTO was created. So, but you want to use, because international standards normally should reflect, because they take years of discussions of experts, the optimal solution for a given problem. Not because the WTO says, it's because this technical body, they get together and form that document saying this is the best way to do this. And if you do this, you will get the result you want, even in policy sense. So as I said, the agreement, and this is something I want to explore in this next slide. The agreement not only presents the use of international standard as an obligation, but as the ultimate, as I mentioned, as a good thing that you should use it. You should be able to use it, and part of the problem and the solution, and this is recognized by the agreement. And sorry for the crowded slide, is that the more chances that you, developing country in particular, will be able to use those international standards comes from the fact that you already participated in the development of those international standards, in those, in the relevant international standardizing bodies, ISO, Codex Alimentarius, etc. And the agreement recognizes that this sometimes is difficult for developing countries, and that members should make their best to really incentivize effective participation of developing countries in those standardizing bodies. Why I'm saying that? Because in practice, if you do not participate, let's say the ISO or any other bodies developing international standard related to medical devices, and they don't get your input, the input of your country, because you have certain risks, certain situations that perhaps other participants don't have, that standard won't reflect your inputs. It increases the chance that when that becomes an international standard, you have to, if you want to regulate that, you have to rely on the exception I just mentioned in the Article 2.4 that is not effective and appropriate for you because it does not take into account what your needs. So you don't want to rely on that, not because it's good that you don't need to comply with WTO obligation, but actually because not being able to implement an international standard is not ideal, even from the point of view of health or a good regulatory practice. You want to be able to use it. So that's the reason why I'm putting all this information here. And then even in the 6 principles that the Tbt committee adopted in the year 2000 on what are the 6 principles to produce a good international standard. One of the points, the last principle, is the developmental dimension, and they really emphasize the need that effective tangible ways to help developing countries to participate. Maybe they can ask technical assistance, because Article 11 of the TBT, and is quoted here, gives this right and obligation for developing countries to request help on how they best participate in standardization, etc. Okay, maybe I'm making this big detour to international standards, but I think because harmonization is such an important element for medical devices, as we saw in previous presentations. I think this the participation in the elaboration of international standards is something that people don't talk much, but I think it's as important as being able to implement something that is already taken. I think this, just my last point, helps also ensure that a country, if effectively participates in international standard setting elaboration, will become more a standard setter rather than a standard taker. But also in general, the standard will be better with the wider participation, the better. That's the reason why one of the principles in the Tbt Agreement itself, in Article 2.7, is precisely the idea that harmonization should be done on as wide a basis as possible. Now, another point, because it was in my outline, I have 6 minutes. It's on conformity assessment procedures. As I said, the idea of conformity assessment procedures is very easy to understand, but the consequences to trade are very, very complex and can be very, very strong. Why? Because basically, conformity assessment procedures are the procedures a country puts in place, and these procedures can be self-certification to third-party certification, complex lab tests, etc. this conformity assessment procedure can take a variety of forms. And even countries that may have the same specifications or very similar specifications addressing similar risks to similar products, a kind of a equivalence at the level of the specifications, they may have totally different or very different in terms of stringency and procedures way to certify that. So if you are exporting to 10 countries which have very similar specifications, but each country's the certification process of each of the 10 countries are very different, you have to make 10 different tests. The potential for that, for creating unnecessary, this lack of harmonization in the procedures can create huge barriers. And also not only barriers in terms of having to do 10 tests in terms of time, but also for costs, in particular for small and medium-sized enterprises and developing countries that, those repetitious, repeating the tests can be very costly, and this, of course, is another way to say it's create barriers. Now, the agreement, besides, I want to explain ways that the agreement deals with excessive or disproportional regulation, though there are disciplines on that. Now, as for technical regulations, the agreements say conformity assessment cannot be more trade received than necessary. They should be based on international standard. They cannot discriminate. But at the same time, for conformity assessment, the agreement has, and this is just a few examples, some mechanisms to facilitate. And those are not, in particularly mutual recognition agreements, are not hard obligations, are encouragements. But in particular, mutual recognition is a very, if countries can do it, can negotiate those with other countries or regionally, those can be very powerful mechanisms to cut some of these transaction costs from multiple tests, because basically, and I think some presentations mentioned to this idea, it's the idea of, a mutual recognition is basically you are trusting. Trust is at the basis of a mutual recognition. You trust that the regulatory certification authority of the other country has the capacity to test against your specifications, and you will trust that those tests are acceptable, and you won't request to be tested again in your country. So you can see the potential of huge implications in terms of facilitating trade, cutting costs. I think it's a very useful mechanism. Of course, at the same time, it's very hard to, and they are not so frequent, right? Mutual recognition is not as frequently as one would like, precisely because it involves this, I wouldn't say subjective, but this more sensitive element of trust. And trust is not only something that you gain, I mean, trust in between regulatory agencies' capability to certify. Trust is not something that is only happening one occasion, is not a static state. Trust is not something that you just write on the paper. It's a permanent state that you have to be, and here go back to my original point, be in constant regulatory dialogue, regulatory cooperation with your trade partners to really ensure that trust is maintained. So, but the reward in terms of trade facilitating is enormous, for mutual recognition, equivalence, all these tools. But we can discuss a little bit more on that later. I just mentioned here one thing, and I think it links with my last point, which is on transparency. I'm almost done with my time here. You may be asking, some of you perhaps, where I'm speaking here a lot of in theory, of course, but normally these mutual recognition agreements are done via bilateral agreements between countries. And the Tbt Agreement in the transparency that I will talk now also requires notification of international agreements dealing with Tbt measures under Article 10.7. And then you can go to our database of transparency, which is the ePing. If you type ePing in Google or any other browser, you get directly to our ePing Tbt SPS database. You'll be able to search for notifications on international agreements between countries, and most of them will be on mutual recognition, to see as examples on how countries do that, including in the area of medical devices, etc. For example, and not only on mutual recognition, on for example, equivalence in terms of if you're a regulatory agency of one country, for example, the Trans-Tasman mutual recognition agreement between New Zealand and Australia, basically they deem a product certified in one country as automatically certified in the other country. But again, to get to that level of trust, it takes time. It's not only a question to comply with the code letter of the agreement. It requires this constant regulatory dialogue to keep trust, maintain trust. And the agreement also, as you see here on the screen, emphasizes a lot the crucial role for this type of facilitating tool, mutual recognition or accreditation, which are the type of conformity assessment to certify that labs and other technical bodies have the required skill, not only at a given moment, but at a permanent basis to perform certain exams and tests. So I mentioned transparency. I think I mean, I don't want to repeat too much here, because I already mentioned various aspects of transparency and how they empower actually regulatory cooperation, and is one of the top elements of good regulatory practice, right? So, but the Tbt Agreement is unique actually in the family of WTO agreements, because it requires, as I mentioned, notifying draft measures. The obligations even start with the drafts. And this is very important because it allows anybody to look to see where other countries are going. It actually is a time of a prediction mechanism of new trends, regulatory trends. If the agreement would only require you to notify the measure when it's already in force, ex post, you'll never be able to, start an early regulatory cooperation discussion, maybe years before, and avoid problems and learn lessons, and maybe induce more harmonization. When you see that in the notifications, 3 or 4 countries are notifying something that you have never even thought about, you may think, well, maybe it's time for me to start thinking about it. I will talk with those countries. Maybe those countries will get some lessons from you, and then perhaps there will be a bit of a harmonization via this dialogue. I think it's quite important. Sometimes notification of drafts allow also not so much to modify laws because or proposals because you raise a problem. Sometimes the problem, we will know that statistically, sometimes countries raise questions on a draft measure in the Tbt committee simply because they want clarification. They didn't understand. Maybe the draft was not so clear. And when the country responds, they understand better. So not being clear on the specifications itself is a trade barrier as well. It's not only because you don't have access to the text, but sometimes because you don't understand what they really meant. And that's another important. And the ePing that I just mentioned, we have a new actually version of the ePing, this database, which actually is much more interactive with stakeholders as well and governments. They can discuss and virtually engage virtually with those type of questions. Now, and here just a broad statistics in terms of notifications by year, by March this year on medical devices. And you can clearly see, that's what I mean in terms of, you can visualize trends clearly here, but you correct me if I'm wrong. There is a huge trend of regulating medical devices since 2000 18 or 19 in particular. Clearly, you see a trend of members regulating such products. Now, Renata, and you are better equipped to me, and maybe we can discuss the reasons behind that. I'm not sure. I may have some guesses. I think perhaps it may be multifaceted. Clearly, countries are much more sensitive to regulate, and regulating per se, as I mentioned, is not a problem. The problem, at least from the TBT, in fact, as I said, countries are sovereign to regulate. It's just if you regulate in a manner that is transparent and not discriminatory, etc. But maybe because consumers want more information, more labeling, because here notifications can be anything. But I think also, and this is my wild guess, we can discuss later, I think also perhaps that medical devices, equipment in particular, are becoming more and more Internet of Things, and they're becoming more and more merged as electronic devices, more complex. So, which means that medical devices are falling in many different levels of regulatory and risks and regulatory preoccupations. So I think that could be, I don't know, that could be another reason. But I think it's an interesting, at least statistically, that regulatory movement is huge, becoming really important. Of course, 2020 is just because it's up to March. Perhaps one other reason was because of the COVID pandemic. Many members notified temporary emergency measures with medical products. So not necessarily equipment, but medical products like PPEs, etc. I had here, but I want to spend time at some examples of notifications. I just I want to, one here from Brazil, which I think is interesting because it's about, and that happens a lot now with the COVID, notification of measures to facilitate, facilitate access to medication. So here it was, instead of conducting its own inspection of pharmaceuticals and medical devices, so Brazil was accepting information from other regulators that participate in this scheme here. So, in the spirit of, because when I say mutual recognition, of course, you can have also an equivalence. You can have that unilaterally. Many countries do that as well. So, so just for you to see an example of a notification on that, and perhaps other countries, again, as I said, you can go, the importance of transparency here, you can go to these notifications, see the details, perhaps there's some examples. My final remarks here, it's on the work of the TBT committee, which complements the code letter of the agreement. As I mentioned, the TBT agreement has all these principles, etc., but then the TBT committee gives more dynamism and to those principles and obligations. Why? Because, as I already mentioned, one practice of the TBT committee is to allow members to raise concerns on mostly draft measures, and they engage in these horizontal discussions, raising preoccupations, questions, doubts, etc. So this is a kind of a collective cooperation. It's a form of regulatory cooperation because it's not litigation. Nobody will decide who is right or wrong. Others that are not even engaging with that specific trade concern, and I think I just go forward here to show two examples of here. One by Canada, China, Japan, etc., against with respect of a medical device regulation in vitro diagnosis by EU, and another one by Canada, Australia, etc., with respect of registration fees for drugs and medical products by China. You see that not all countries, including South Africa, for example, is not one of them, raised it, but that discussion took place in front of everybody, and we have the minutes. Perhaps other countries can learn from those discussions and draw lessons from it. And so it's good regulatory cooperation, not only between those concerned expressly, but even for those who are passively listening and learning from it. Okay. And finally, another important element is what we call I call the vertical one, the specific towards concern, and the horizontal discussion is this type of, it's not a treaty making work, but it's the work of the Tbt committee in giving very substantive guidance and recommendations to better implement the obligations. And then organizing thematic sessions on topic. Renata already spoke in our committee some years ago on even the medical devices regulations, but also actual practical, detailed guidance on different aspects of the agreement. And one of them I already mentioned in my presentation. I go back here to the quote, was this 6 principles here. Sorry, the last paragraph of that was a decision of the committee on principles on what a good international standard within the spirit of the Tbt agreement should contain, including principle 6 on the development dimension to guarantee effective participation of developing countries in standard setting. So international standards are meaningful for developing countries. I will conclude here, just putting my key messages again, but I just want to highlight one additional point, if I may, Renata, and then I will stop. Is the following, but it's related to something that I already mentioned. Is this, and maybe others may agree or disagree, but I see that more than ever, it's important to engage in trade and regulatory cooperation and in the area of medical devices, precisely because they're becoming so complex, precisely because of Internet of Things, that medical devices equipment are becoming interconnected with Internet. To see, perhaps, and again, is my personal opinion, to see regulatory cooperation and in an even broader sense, beyond even TBT. Because when you have these devices connected to the Internet, you have elements of services, Internet of elements of cybersecurity, privacy, regulations in this area are becoming so multifaceted. And I think I can see a big challenge for developing countries to keep up with regulations from other countries that regulate this product from all these different perspectives. And again, a way to help go back to the idea of international standards, because you do have international standards now addressing Internet of Things, including the health area. So you have standardizing work done in committees that normally is not the committee that you pay attention if you're interested in medical products. Just to give an example, it's not necessary for medical equipment, but it has to do with health products or health, which is the IEC, the other international standardizing body on electrotechnical committee here in Geneva, created a commission on what they call digital bioconvergence. So this whole idea that synthetic biology, all these biological processes are merging with artificial intelligence and machine learning to produce new products, new organisms, and the digital and the biological are converging. And so this committee is taking place in a body that has to do with electronics, but it's about also medical product. So it's a challenge, I think, in particular for developing countries to keep up with all of this. But I think the key is international standards in the sense that they will normally produce documents that will deal with all these complex, novel, complex technological regulatory challenges, and the document will be there available rather than create new regulatory on your own. Each country individually coming up with its own type of regulation. And finally, I think that if there is another thing, is that this type of new product that merge all these elements, in terms of risks, the risk will be common for everybody. Cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, all these elements, they may sound esoteric, but actually only with international cooperation we will be able to come up with some common ground to regulate this type of risks and the virtues, including as they apply to medical equipment. sorry to end up with two a little bit esoteric technological scientific remarks, but I think it could be useful for you. And I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
No, that's very important, Lauro, and your presentation was excellent. Thank you. I would have so many comments to make, but one of the main activities that we are trying to do within the work of the coalition I'm part of is to educate countries and authorities to use the notification system to the benefit of everyone. And this, I think that was a very important point that you made. And also the main objective of our work is also to try to educate the countries we are working with to use one standard, one technical regulation, when necessary, one test, one certificate accepted everywhere for the same device and equipment. So thank you. I think your presentation is very much aligned with the work we have been doing. Thank you so much. I think we might have a few questions, but I would like to introduce our next speaker first. I'm delighted to introduce Charles Sibia. Let me know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Charles. Charles is the South African Bureau of Standard Certification Chemical Sector Manager, which includes rubber, plastics, petrochemical, and chemicals. He has been with the South African Bureau of Standards for 13 years, 4 years in laboratories and 9 years with certification. Charles, please, the floor is yours. I think your camera is off. Perfect. It's coming.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can hear you. We cannot see you, Charles.
I think I've been having some problems with my devices. I'm not sure what is going on.
It's okay. We can hear you perfectly. Do you have a presentation to share? Would you like to share screen or no?
No. In fact, I don't have a presentation to share. It will just be an informative session. I've been reading some of the comments where I'm not sure whether our colleagues and guests, they understand the difference between what SAPS does and also what SANAS does. I think from our side, the SAPS is a standard development body that develops all South African standards, but it has an influence on the industry. The industry is the one that initiates the development of the standard. It means the South African Bureau of Standards does not necessarily develop the standard without any initiation from the industry. So I've seen some of the comments where colleagues are asking as to if SANAS will be able to develop all the standards or adopt all the standards. So my question, my response to that is that the industry itself needs to come up with all relevant standards that they want to be adopted or developed for the South African market. Then after that, we coordinate that development. But I think my colleague also, Fallen, will talk to that extent tomorrow, where she'll be, where she'll be indicating all steps as to how the standards are developed. But if I were to give a high level information as to how the standards are developed, the industry itself will make an initiative to the South African Bureau of Standards, to the Standards Development Division, which is the one that developed the standard. Then a meeting is conveyed for all participants. The standard, the South African Bureau of Standards is just to coordinate that all the requirements as per ISO are met. Some of them, there will be barrier to trade, will be make sure that the alignment of the standard is a universal. It can be used also in other countries, or else the SAPS can adopt the standard from different countries, be it is your European countries, your British, Brazil, wherever the existing standard is. So that is when the SAPS play a critical role. Then all other activities, they are voluntary. The SAPS doesn't regulate any standard. I think in this case, which is a medical device, SAPRA will be doing the regulation. And if there is any accreditation related issues, those are managed by SANAS. The SAPS only comes in the voluntary requirement of that particular industry or that particular manufacturer, where they will come to the SAPS and say, for us, we are having this product, there is a standard which we want to be certified against. Then the SAPS plays a role in the certification side, but not on the regulation side. As I'm saying, the standards are voluntary. Yeah, that will be my short contribution to this. As I'm saying, we are not necessarily on the regulation part, but we are more on the standard development, and also we assist the manufacturers when they want to certify their products into the existing standard. Thank you very much, Renata.
Thank you, Charles. I guess you addressed the questions, right? In the chat from.
Hi, Renata. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. And Charles, I guess you addressed the comments in the chat, right? I don't know if you have further comments to make on your side from the work you developed.
In fact, I think I've addressed John. He has two questions, but I think he might be referring to SAPS, not SANAS.
I agree.
Yeah. So yeah, the SAPS is the one that developed the standard. SANAS, they do what you call, if you have your facility, be it you are a manufacturer or you are a body that wants to be accredited, that is where SANAS comes in on the accreditation side. But on the certification side, where you want your products to be certified so that you can trade them and they have the SAPS approved logo, that is where the SAPS come in. Thank you.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much. There is Charles, if you don't have further comments, I guess we can address also another question that we have in the chat, and both for you and Lauro. There is a question, why should there be an additional pre-export import conformity assessment procedure for medical devices that undergo full product registration in a country? I don't know if you'd like to make a comment on that, or Lauro.
I can start by making a comment. Or maybe Laura can you go? I'll come after you.
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think that maybe I already mentioned a little bit this when I was talking about mutual recognition agreements or unilateral recognition agreements, unilateral recognition. That I think, unfortunately, but it's not, it's part of the situation. Not when you are, if I understood the question, he's asking, he or she is asking if if the products are certified in my country, why when it's in the other country has to be certified again, right? I don't know if you understood the question as essentially this.
That was my understanding as well.
Okay, yeah, so there may be various reasons. For example, I mean, if you are say, exporting tires and your country safety and quality specifications, you the exporter, your country, are very different from the specifications of the importing country. They have totally different objectives, very different. The importing country, you have to certify domestically because that's required to produce and sell internally against your specification. But you will have to probably do again because the other country has a different set of specifications, and they also want to know if you are complying as a condition to import to that country. So that's one situation in which actually you have duplication. The duplication of certification is caused by the fact that the specifications themselves are different. So that's the reason why one way the Tbt agreement, there are two ways the Tbt agreement tries to ameliorate this problem, is that they either you have harmonization. So of course, if the two countries apply the same, base their tire measures based on the same international standards, the specification will be very similar, if not identical. Then still you have the certification, but that increases the chance that if you do the certification in your country, it increases the chance to be accepted in the other country. You don't need to do it again, but not necessarily, because certification, as I mentioned, requires something more than complying with the letter of the law. It's also about trust. It will require that the certification authorities of the other country, they say, okay, very well, that tires is complying with a law in its country that is identical to mine. We see things in the same way, but how can I trust if their labs really did a good job? I have to trust, they have to be accredited, etc. So that's the reason why if they have a mutual recognition, or if that country unilaterally trusts you, it will just say, but I think that's, or if you're part of a regional lab scheme or all sort of a regional international schemes, then you won't be able to, you don't need to do twice. You will just do once. My final point is that there is a third, at least, maybe more situation. There's another situation in which even, let's say that you export your tires and to only that other country, and actually you wanted to produce those tires only take into account because you only want to export the specifications of that country. Okay, so even if there is no equivalence or harmonization, you can still try to produce the accordance with specifications of the other country, but use your labs in your country because it's easier, it's cheaper to perform the test. If you have a mutual recognition agreement of results, even if the specifications are not identical, because the Tbt do not require that, you don't need to do twice the test. So I think that, and then on enabling all of this is the key issue of accreditation. Because when labs are accredited by reputable accreditation bodies, then chances of trust increase immensely. So sorry for the long response, but I think more or less it would be more or less.
Charles, I'll pass you the word, but I think the same person made a clarification. He said, I meant in the same country, for example, Kenya has full registration for a medical device, yet it requires a pre-verification, a pre-export verification of conformity for the same device prior to importation, in addition to the product registration. Laura, would you like to?
Yeah. Okay. So this is okay. That's an interesting situation. It's more like inverse discrimination almost, because you're putting your product in the other market in a less advantageous position, because if they don't ask the same twice, so they have less cost. But I don't know the specifics. There may be reasons why you need to do conformity assessment for export as well. For example, perhaps you don't want to, perhaps there's some high risk that maybe it's a conformity assessment to from something that can leak, or something that can be dangerous in the trade process itself at customs. There may be a situation. If this is a general rule, then it's strange, because I think that's normally not what is done. Perhaps also there is some sort of dual use. I don't know, I'm just guessing here, but some countries have dual use regulation. Many products can be used for normal purposes, but sometimes they can be used as guns or weapons, or something that that is not questions of national security. Maybe I want to certify that, and that's normally related to export controls. I don't know.
Yeah,
like
it makes sense. Yeah, makes sense to me. Charles, would you like to complement?
Can you start with the Makatso? I think she wants to, wants to say something.
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead, Dr. Matibi.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just to clarify the statement, because I'm the one who asked, because initially the statement was not clear. So if you look at Kenya currently, it's two different entities that are requesting two different documents in one country. So if you're looking into Kenya, you're looking at the trade and industry, they're requiring at the port of entry, it's PVOC. And then when you're looking at the regulator, which is KPPB, they're doing product registration. So you see there are two totally different entities, but how you've answered it correctly, that this is also based on the quality and the safety of the product that are entering at the minimum PVOC, which is your conformity assessment and verification procedure of specific goods. And then the medical devices falls under those specific goods that they have identified as risk products that are coming into the country. But this is required from a trade perspective. And when you're looking at who's requesting product registration, it's the KPPB, which is their mandate to ensure that product that are registered in the country, they will review the technical dossier of the product. Thank you.
Yeah, Renata, may I just add one thing? I mean, while you were explaining, I was just also thinking about something I haven't mentioned, but I think is very important, which is this discussion we have with the Tbt Committee on national quality infrastructure. Because even if you have a situations in which it is warranted, is justifiable to have double certification, which is a justifiable extra hurdle. That, of course, if you have those hurdles, they will impact the competitive situation of the product in the export market, because there's an additional cost, but it's justifiable. Maybe national quality infrastructure, the idea is also maybe there are optimal ways to expedite this, to do this as efficiently as possible. So the duplication, which maybe even if it's necessary, can be done efficiently, quickly. So to reduce the impact as much as possible. So I don't know, I'm just an idea, but I think just to try to link with this idea of national quality infrastructure, which is precisely how to have the paper part, but also the infrastructure part, the knowledge all together, is to run this machine, the regulatory machine, as efficiently as possible. Because if it's not, even if it's justified, if it is too difficult to do it and time consuming, from the perspective of developing countries in particular, you lose competitiveness, because you are adding to your own exporters' cost. But even when it's totally necessary, but perhaps there is ways to make it less problematic.
Yeah, less burdensome. Charles, would you like to comment?
Yeah, in fact, I think one of the issues, although specifics would have been nicer. I think Laura has touched on the trust issue. You find that other countries, they have less trust on certain products coming from other parts of the world. So it means they need a reassurance that those particular products that are being imported, or else the other one which will be receiving it as an export is a good product and is fit for use. I know for a fact that during COVID times here in South Africa, there were countries like your Namibia and I think the very same Kenya, which has been mentioned, where they were taking these sanitizers from South Africa. They were adamant that it must have been tested and it must be SABS approved. So it means those relationship between the countries is very, very crucial in terms of trusting. But at the same time, the uniformity, which is the one that is being driven here, it eliminates all those mishaps that other people might have in their thinking, into saying, if I get certain products from one country is a superior product from the other country. So that uniformity and that regulation that will be global is very, very crucial.
Excellent, Charles. There are two more questions to you, and I guess maybe it's a good moment to ask, so we can continue with your explanations from Anton. Which medical standards is the SABS accredited test for conformity? And as a local manufacturer, I'm required to send my products abroad to have tested, for example, ISO 10993 extractables and leachables of plastic. Would you like to talk a little bit about the tests for conformity?
Yeah, this one will depend on the product. There is quite a number of, we call them medical devices. I think the one, you have no more questions there. There are a number of medical devices that the SABS is certifying to include. You find that your sutures, your catheters, your condoms, but I don't think it falls within the ambit which we are talking about right now. So this would be, remember my statement when I said SABS standards to the industry here in South Africa, they are more voluntary. But when it comes to SAPRA and also other regulatory environment, regulatory bodies, they regulate according to the requirements that they've identified, but based on the standard that the SABS has approved, that has developed. But when it comes to the industry itself, the SABS is only offering what is voluntary. If the manufacturer comes and say, here's the product that I'm making, I want them to be SABS approved, that is where we come in. I'm not sure explicitly as to what Mr. Kutsia is referring to, but we do have some where we are certifying, as I'm saying, they are under medical devices, but whether they fall under the ambit which we are talking about right now, I'm not sure. Maybe he can drop us an email just to ask exactly as to which ones they are, so that we can be able to answer. But I can affirm that is not a lot of it, because the market is not necessarily having an appetite on having their product SABS approved, but we do have a few.
Okay, perfect. I think also the question was a little bit outside the scope of the panel, but I think you provided very clear directions. There is another question here. that I don't know which of you would like to start answering, if you can. How are we foreseeing drop shipments entering the country? I think it might be more for you, Charles. IVD, HIV tests are Class D, but are available to purchase over the websites and OTC to the patients. I understand economy equity by allowing parallel importation, but storage and transportation conditions will vary. Do we foresee this in the MDRC? I don't know. We can also come back to this question and answer afterwards in written, but if you would like to
yeah,
try.
one thing that I can confirm is that we are not necessarily we are not playing in this domain on the HIV test and all that. So, but maybe it is something, if there is an appetite on the market, that's where we can start expanding into looking into it, so that we can play in that space. But for now, we are not playing in that environment.
It might be a question for Safra probably, and yeah.
I would think so.
Right, and so we can come back to this tomorrow probably.
Sorry, Renata. I mean, we have Dr. Mativa here, so probably she can help us. I mean, I don't know if you feel like so, Dr. Mativa.
I'm still unclear on the question, honestly speaking. How are we foreseeing drop shipment entering the country? So that statement, starting with that, is unclear. And do we foresee it being discussed at MDRC? What is the specific topic that the person that the query is asking? I'm not clear, honestly. And so now it's an IVD HIV test are Class D, but available to purchase over the website and OTC to the patient. So there are different types of HIV. There is self-test kit for HIV and the one that is being issued by the healthcare professional. So there has been a Section 36, which is an exemption that was granted specifically for self-test kit. The difference is the advertisement. You have to, looking into our legislative framework, speaking to how do you advertise product and also allowing certain product to be placed on the market is different. So for example, advertisement is not allowed, but for specific product, it is allowed based on the nature of the product. So I'm hoping I'm answering the second part, but as of the first part, I'm not understanding how are we foreseeing drop shipment entering the country? I'm not clear on that. And also on understanding the economic part will be maybe by my colleagues regarding the trade, because I understand economic equity by allowing parallel importation, but storage and transportation condition will vary. If I speak to storage and transportation conditions, the product's quality must remain intact during these proceedings as per regulatory requirements. So, but I'm not clear. So I don't want to further answer on something that is not clarified properly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matibi. And also the audience, you have our emails. I don't know who asked the question, but please feel free to send us an email in written with more detail, and we can go back to you with a more detailed answer as well. But I think that was very, very, very good, Dr. Matibi. Thank you very much. Since we don't have any further questions, I guess I can hand over to Dr. Matibi and Sandra Gonzalez for final remarks. I'd like to thank Lauro. Go ahead. I see your hand.
Sorry, Renata, I don't want to delay too much. Can I just make a final point?
Sure.
Because I think since most of the questions were related to also export and customs related issue, just one point that I think I want to make is that the importance of also pay attention on TBT issues outside TBT, including the new trade facilitation agreement. Yeah. And the trade facilitation agreement, in fact, has various provisions dealing with technical regulations and standards, not only on the use of international standards, but also on the application of technical regulations at the border. One aspect is just to note that they have one obligation not to enforce technical regulations with respect to goods in transit. But also, and here's my, and then there's other considerations, but related to technical regulations and SPS sanitary measures, because I think many countries, there is this divide between, oh, okay, agencies, regulatory agencies, but then what's happening at the border, at customs, and not necessarily in all countries are knowledgeable about this whole, what we discussed today here. They are not in the mindset of technical regulations when they are part of technical regulation, because market surveillance, the enforcement of technical regulation is part of TBT. And in that, I conclude with one thing, is that one important and very can be very severe consequences issue is the illicit trade. And as you may know, just 2 weeks ago in the Aid for Trade event here, our Director General launched a publication called Illicit Trade, Better Trade for Better Health, a publication on illicit trade in medical products, and where identifying where TBT, trade facilitation, TRIPS agreement, and other agreements work together to help members to face this issue, because and it's mostly about the border. I mean, not only, but mainly about the border, how you control your border, how you have the infrastructure, how you can really test if products are really compliant. And just to give a figure, just 2019, illicit trade had a 2.8% of the global trade was in illicit trade, equivalent of $500 billion. Okay, no, sorry, $536 billion, $500 billion of trade in 2018 was about illicit trade. And this is not only a challenge for and a problem for in terms of course, first and foremost is an issue of health and safety of consumers, because if you're consuming illicit medical devices, health devices, you can die. But also, and we'll conclude with that, going back to something I mentioned, if a country doesn't have a very good way to tackle illicit trade, and will have all these consequences to consumers, they will lose trust that their regulatory authorities can really guarantee that the products they buy are safe. And that erosion of trust can have impact not only domestically, but even for the issues we discuss in terms of facilitating, accepting results, etc. This is more a long term, but I will post here on the chat the link to the event with the video, with the DG and members of other organizations, and of the publication itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I was actually searching for a link. I sent one to Sandra. She just posted, I think, in the chat. I don't know if that's the one, but please go ahead and share the one you'd like to share. Yeah. So I guess, I don't know, Charles, if you have some final comments before I hand over to Sandra and Dr. Matibi.
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, thank you again, then Charles and Lauro. This was a very, very interesting session. Thank you so much. Thank you, the audience, for the questions. And Dr. Matibi and Sandra, I hand over to you for final comments.
Thank you very much. Sandra, if you may allow me, I can come first.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I just want to thank our colleague, Mr. Locks and Mr. Sibia, for all the information that they have shared with us, and the work that is being done, exactly like separation between SANAS and SABSA. So we really appreciate that kind of information, but it does show the collaboration that is required between various government entities to ensure that there's access of medical devices, including IVDs in the market, as we are speaking to the medical device at the current moment, which is the point of discussion. So it shows that the collaboration, cooperation, and also integration, as well as coming together to speak to the industry in one voice, shows that we are
going towards one direction. And if I can go back and to one of the mandate, you're looking at the mandate of SAPRA is access to medical device, and working together with the various, as I indicated, entities. It helps us to ensure that there's access, not forgetting that, but it has to comply to the requirements, because it's our responsibility to ensure that the products that are in the market are safe, and then the quality of it is good, and they're working as they intended to. So, but I would like to thank the earlier colleagues as well, Ms. Agnes Kijo, as well as Kanyisile, for sharing the information about the regulatory, good regulatory practice, good reliance practice, and also looking at the WHO model that was published for the second round. And maybe the industry can use the opportunity to review that, and also further information on the WHO GBT model that is available that can be used. So for that, we are thankful. And I'm really thankful to Kanye as well, sharing the position of SAPRA at the current moment and where we are going. And we will still engage. And also the support from our sponsors regarding this kind of topics, because the nearer we are to the public, it helps. All of us, we want one thing out of this whole thing: compliance. And for me, this is one of the ways that we engage with the industry to ensure that the product that is in our market is safe and the quality of it is good and it's performing accordingly. So with that said, Sandra, I would like to hand back to you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mativa, and thank you very much for our panelists and moderators today. I think that we made kind of like a journey in the past 3 hours. I mean, we went from very basic good regulatory practice concepts all the way to how do they benefit at the end of the day the patients in our countries, in our regions, and how all this process is really something that we all together, all relevant stakeholders in the medical technology sector are co-responsible. We talked about voluntary standards that are developed based on the feedback, based on the input, the expertise, the knowledge of all relevant stakeholders from academia, research and development, of course, regulators around the world, and the industry as well. So whenever we are in this, I would say, privileged position as to leverage on all the really great work that has been done, probably in a much faster speed as compared to as it used to be because of the pandemic, we certainly can continue to focus to advance all the efforts related to convergence that are definitely critical in order to achieve the possibility of implementing Reliance, and as Agnes was mentioning, to make sure that available resources, mainly at the national regulators, but of course also at the industry level, are used in the most efficient and effective way as to ensure timely availability of medical technology, of medical devices to the patients in South Africa. So really, thank you very much for your participation today. I think input has been very, very valuable. As always, we end up these sessions having additional questions, and we are certain that in the event tomorrow, we will have opportunity to address more of them. And of course, in the program that we are developing for the forthcoming months, we will have additional opportunities to do so. So without further ado, thank you very much. Have a great rest of your afternoon or your day, depending on the region where you are located, and look forward to meet you all tomorrow at the same time. Thank you.